Welcome back to Marvelous Videos. I'm Rylan, and this is Wyald Origins. Some extreme and reviling apostle who is not in anime for a reason. Explored. Once again, we know that you guys have been waiting for this one to drop, so here we are. There was a few good reasons why we didn't talk about this guy for so long. Number one, most panels he shows up in are practically unstable because of how edgy he is. And number two, we wanted to make sure that this is as deep as you guys wanted us to go into the Berserk lore. But since you guys have been going wild in our comment section, well, it's about time that we talked about Wyald. There is a reason the entire Berserk community is united into thinking that this dude is the absolute worst kind of human, or rather apostle, because in that context, he is a perfect specimen. Wyald embodies the most extreme elements of the concept of do what thou wilt. When the silhouette of a malicious serial violator floats in your mind after hearing such a phrase, you know that that guy is nothing compared to Wyald. But enough build up. Let's get into what he actually does and why he might have reached this point in his life. This is Wyald's origins, explored. But before we get into our explanation, we do have just one very small request. If you like our content, then please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is just one small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thanks. Now, let's begin. He is the final resort that the King of Midland uses in his mad pursuit of Griffith, Wyald's introduction to Berserk. In every adaptation of Berserk, the King of Midland's pursuit of Griffith following his escape from the Tower of Rebirth is restricted to the Bakiraka assassins. After that, he just dedicates most of his fighting forces to looking for the White Falcon, as he himself triggers the events that led to the eclipse. But in the manga, the Bakiraka are just one step of the King's revenge plan. Step 2 is the infamous Black Dog Knights. As the King promises Charlotte to never give up his chase for Griffith, he looks on in despair, realizing that the White Falcon has taken even his daughter's platonic devotion from him. As soon as Charlotte gets out of earshot, he orders his men to send the Black Dog Knights after the escaping Griffith rescue team and the rest of the band of the Falcon. One of them asks him to reconsider this decision, but the King slaps him and tells him to tell the leader of the Black Dogs, Wyald, that he can name his position and reward if he brought him Griffith's head. And we don't exactly think he said that metaphorically. One of the soldiers asks his superior why he was so tense about this decision. The Black Dog Knights might be made of former criminals, and their track record might not have been so stellar as the band of the Falcons, but they still did pretty well during the 100 Years' War, all things considered. He was just called a fool for his ignorance, because he didn't know the nature of their success. It seems like the superior officer is being aristocratic when he says that the Black Dogs are a disgrace to knighthood, but his opinion of them and Wyald is proven correct rather quickly. The officer thinks to himself that there was probably something bestial about Wyald, and the man himself proves this assumption correct as he is introduced pumping through a sea of flesh. As Wyald is, well, enjoying his break, I suppose, he is visited by one of the cronies, who informs him that they have been summoned by the King of Midland urgently. Wyald tries to brush him off as he's busy at the moment and has other things to attend to, but he stops short of nearly strangling the woman he was coupling with when he hears about the mission. Wyald learns that the Black Dog Knights were to pursue and annihilate the band of the Falcon and their escaped leader, Griffith, and this makes him rise out of bed. Turns out he's got business with Griffith, and it becomes clear real soon about what that business is. An apostle who rose to knighthood through sheer strength and madness. How Wyald joined Midland's ranks. The King of Midland thinks back to his first meeting with Wyald as he despairs about his current mental state, and this is where we learned that the leader of the Black Dogs is actually an apostle. 5 years ago, the King had assembled all the able-bodied criminals of Midland to create a fighting force that would compensate for the shortage of soldiers in the 100-Year War. Of all the men gathered, only one of them actually volunteered for the force and went a step further by nominating himself as their leader. He was a bizarre man who seemed almost ape-like, with wild features and an otherworldly figure. Plainly put, he was inhuman in the eyes of the King, and that's because Wyald was actually an apostle. He tells the King that amongst criminals, only the strongest leads, so he should be their leader, which draws many jeers from the crowd. One man, called Barbo the Armor Hacker, steps forward to put Wyald in his place, calling him Monkey for added psychological pressure, but it only ends up exciting him. He tells the King to let him have a go at Barbo. If he won, he would lead the Black Dog Knights. The King, accepting criminal custom, allowed them to go at it. Anybody with eyes could see that Barbo had the clear advantage in this fight. His size alone accounted for that, but Wyald also handicapped himself by refusing to get out of his bonds, and even taking a sword to defend himself. He declared that in order to lead ruffians like these future brethren of his, a show needed to be put on, and charisma needed to be displayed. He decided to accomplish both by dedicating a new statue to the King on top of a tower. Barbo, impatient and anxious to fight, lunges at Wyald, and everyone thinks that he'll be done with just one swing. All are stunned into silence to see what the bound-up convict meant by a new statue. The Apostle attacks Barbo so hard and fast that his body flew into the air and landed on the spiked top of the tower. It was an unbelievable spectacle, but the fearful charisma oozing from Wyald was undeniable. In the time the Black Dog Knights had been active, they'd covered themselves in as many victories as the Band of the Falcon, and they had committed far more atrocities than all his armies combined. Everywhere they went, the stories were the same. Women violated, children murdered, entire villages burnt to a crisp. This is why we said that the officer from earlier was onto something when he called Wyald a beast and unworthy of being labeled a knight. The king recognized that the Black Dogs were his hounds from hell, and so he only unleashed them upon remote threats to the kingdom, lest they molest his own subjects. But now they had been turned loose on the object of his madness, and he begged for them to accomplish his heart's desire. If you thought that the tales about the Black Dog Knights being savage warriors were false, these thoughts would be quickly abated by their actions later on in the same chapter. The Griffith rescue team took help and shelter from a farmer's family on their journey out of Wyndham. Those people believed in the leadership of the White Falcon, the savior of the kingdom, more than the gossip coming out of the capital. Casca thanks them for their assistance, and Guts and Judo whisk them away from there, but no sooner are they gone than Wyald and his black dogs show up. The Apostle, leader of the band of glorified criminals, ominously inquires about the whereabouts of the Griffith rescue party before deciding to get the juices flowing before he begins his falcon hunt. And by that, he means butchering and violating every member of the family, because his motto was quite simply, make it fun, make it stimulating. And suddenly, you realize that you would rather go to jail than be comrades with a guy like Wyald. The lead black dog orders his men to use the corpses of their recent prey as banners in their pursuit of Griffith and his party, and Judo recognizes them by their calling card. Guts and Pippin try to hold the pursuers back as Casca and Judo set up a trap to cut them off, but the future black swordsman faces something for the first time in his life. He knows that Wyald's men, who are crashing him into the waves, are driven on by fear, and he understands why when he himself faces the guy. As the Apostle starts toying with Guts and Pippin, the former realizes that Wyald is comparing his bloodlust to that of Zod and the Skull Knight. This is why he doesn't hesitate for a second when Casca signals the retreat. In fact, he helps her speed it up. But despite riddling the path with explosives and boulders and all sorts of lethal traps, the escaping band of the Falcon was not able to slow down Wyald and his black dogs. Their pursuit wasn't exactly out of a sense of justice or anything like that, but it was out of pure fear of the man called Wyald. When a subordinate of his tried to dissuade him from chasing the Griffith rescue team, Wyald pinched his head off and called him a boring grown-up. He screamed at his dogs to recite their motto, and recite it they did, to enjoy and excite. Wyald commanded his men to not forget that fact, as they continued to die like flies, giving chase to the fleeing Falcons. Each trap the band of the Falcons sprung on Wyald's party managed to take all sorts of casualties, except the Apostle himself. He smashed a boulder and tore through an explosion to continue his mad chase of the prophesied fifth angel. When Wyald and his men finally managed to corner the band of the Falcon, the Black Dogs were considerably down in their numbers, but their leader was excited about some real battle. He prepared to unleash his hounds, but Guts stepped forward and declared himself Wyald's opponent. The 100-man Slayer did not know what Wyald and his lot were, but he vowed to take these monsters down personally. Little did he know that this would be the last time he would wield his sword in protection of Griffith, and also the last time he'd fight an apostle without bearing the brand of sacrifice. He came out for a snack, but stayed for a meal. Wyald attacks the band of the Falcon on the eclipse's eve. Guts calling Wyald a monster makes the Apostle laugh, as he realized that this is the guy Zod was talking about. He invites the 100-man Slayer to play with him, and uses a wooden log as a weapon. The battle between Guts and Wyald is like a storm of swords. The two warriors fought with such speed and ferocity that others dared not even get in their way. Most of the band of the Falcon were elated by the fact that Guts was keeping up with a literal monster, but Casca knew it was the other way around. The future Black Swordsman had far surpassed the skill level of his youth, being a fighter with no peer in his era, and yet Wyald was countering all his blows with a club and pure reflex. Just as Guts thought he found an opening by aiming at Wyald's head, the Apostle stopped his advance by stopping his sword with his bare teeth. Similar to how Guts had once shown Griffith how to use mouths in battle, the 100-man Slayer had to vault off of his horse to knock his own sword loose. Guts, ever defiant, asks Wyald what in the heck does he eat with those teeth, but the Apostle is too busy admiring the delectable meal that he has in his hands. This rescue force was not only meant to be a small snack before the nocturnal feast of the eclipse, but Wyald didn't care anymore. He was going to gorge himself here and not wait for that second time, and with that intent, he approached Guts once more. But before he could engage, the rest of the band of the Falcon put his comrades to a rout, and Wyald was only amused by this. He remarked that his dogs gave up way too easily, so he was going to put them out of their misery himself. Wyald knocked a massive tree over and crushed his own retreating Black Dog Knights, then proceeded to lecture them about thinking positively. The apostle speared one of his trembling men with a log, and then took off his own armor and clothes, transforming into a hideous ape-like released state. Wyald ripped off an entire tree to use as a club this time, and he whacked Gus with it, sending him hurling through the air. Casca, stunned by this, led an impulse charge, but her horse capsized at the last possible moment. The ape apostle notices her and decides he wants to dance with her, but is pocked full of holes by the band of the Falcons' crossbowmen. Wyald becomes enraged by this, because he doesn't exactly appreciate interruption when he is slaying or laying, and he proceeds to give Griffith's men a taste of the hell they were soon going to witness. The demon ape rampages through the woods, eating horses and falcons alike, and forcing Griffith's band into a retreat. Only Casca was the one not paying attention to the carnage, as she was focused on making Guts regain his consciousness. She slapped him so many times, she busted his lip open, but it was seemingly to no avail. That's where Wyald found her, covering over the 100 Manslayer's prone body. He picked her up and prepared for his, shall we say, tongue. But before the apostle could violate Casca any further, Guts chopped his member off, and then his arm holding the woman he loved. This managed to push Wyald further into the depths of rage, and he engaged the future Black Swordsman in a fierce battle. Despite being chopped up at a few different locations, Wyald kept pressing Guts back with just his booming war cry. The apostle fell on his back, but used the opportunity to nab Guts and hurl him through multiple trees. Wyald thought he had killed Guts with the force that he had just used now, because he wasn't exactly holding back. But this is where everything starts changing for the master of enjoyment and excitement. So far, Wyald had been an overwhelming presence on the field of battle, even before he transformed. Some of the things he did already classified him as a monster. Now, in his released state, his personality becomes far worse, and his body became far stronger. Technically, that is the recipe for a fierce fighter who approaches his enemies with zero fear, instead instilling fear within them. And while Wyald is that kind of guy for most people, that is not the case for Guts, and that is why everything changes. He was a lecherous old man in his life as a human. Wyald's death and true origins. When the fearless Wyald approached his victim intent on admiring his handiwork, he didn't expect to get an eyeful of sword instead of a death prattle, and that is exactly what ended up happening. This only managed to piss off Wyald even further, and he punched Guts directly with his massive fists. If the 100 Manslayer had not blocked it at the right moment, there is no telling how things could have gone. But even that one swing was still so powerful that it broke Guts' sword, and Wyald was nowhere near giving up. He had smacked Guts so far away once again that he had to go hunting for him, but he didn't mind it. This was the first time in 100 years that someone had actually managed to hurt him this bad, so he might have got carried away a little bit. He promised Guts that he would be a little more careful killing him as he spotted the trap that awaited him. He broke the tree that Guts was hiding near instead of walking towards him, and smashed what he thought was Guts himself, falling from above clad in armor. Instead, what he found was a log that the future Black Swordsman had somehow dressed up in his major armor pieces within the span of minutes. The man himself lunged at Wyald from above and drove his sword deep into the apostle's shoulder. He then plunged several knives into the apostle's upper head, all the while fending off feral attacks from his gigantic fists. It took Wyald bashing himself into a tree to get rid of Guts, but then he himself fell down because of all the blood loss. Everyone thought that Guts had done it. The apostle was not moving anymore, and neither did it seem like he was breathing. The band of the Falcons set up camp a bit further from his apparent corpse and rested for a bit before hitting the road once again. But something seemed odd. As you guys all know, when an apostle dies, their soul is dragged into the abyss, and their human bodies are left behind in the physical world. That is not what happened when Wyald died. He just lay there lifeless, because it turns out he was playing possum. After an appropriate amount of time had passed, he woke up and slaughtered everyone guarding him before making his way to Griffith's carriage to try and save himself from his own hellish fate. When Wyald finds Griffith, he senses that he has no time left, and so he immediately commands Griffith to summon the God Hand and start the eclipse before the promised time, so that he himself could survive. He reasons that if Griffith is the guy Zod was talking about, and was destined to become the 5th guardian angel of desire, then he should have the Crimson Behelit. Before he could go any further, Wyald is interrupted by the band of the Falcon, who have formed up around him with the intention of taking Griffith alive, but the apostle is done with their hopeless optimism. Being a reincarnated demon, he knows their fates and taunts them for it before exposing the truth behind Griffith's condition. So far, the rest of the band had been kept in the dark by Casca and company regarding the full extent of Griffith's injuries, but Wyald decided to just show them instead. He also relayed the details of the torture the fallen Falcon had endured at the hands of the Tower of Rebirth's jailer, which he probably knew because he was friends with the guy or something. The apostle reveled in the hopeless situation that his friends found themselves in, and thought it the perfect atmosphere to summon the God Hand when he realized that Griffith didn't have the Behelit on him. In chapter 40, we saw that as the aforementioned jailer began working Griffith over, he wanted to take his Behelit as a souvenir, but dropped it into the drain. But of course, Wyald doesn't know about this, so he starts freaking the heck out. But just then, an even bigger problem for him descends from the skies. That's because Nosferatu's Zod arrives on the scene to make sure that the Master of Enjoyment and Excitement did not do anything that messed up Causality's design. Before Wyald even has any time to react, Zod impales him with his mighty horns and lifts him up into the sky. At this point, the Black Dog Knight has lost all the cards he was holding at the beginning of this whole encounter. Wyald was baffled as to why Zod would attack him, and for a moment thought his guardian angels themselves had ordered it, because as apostles, 1, they were on the same side, and 2, they all received the same creed for life from the God Hand, do as thou wilt. If Wyald had killed Griffith, despite him being destined to ascend as the Angel of Longing, it would be his free will, to which Zod replied that tearing him apart would also be the Immortal One's free will. The sinister criminal knight of Midland, who had taken countless lives and violated countless more, died begging to be spared, because according to him, having a Behelit was proof of one's fate, and since Griffith didn't have it on him, he clearly wasn't one. Zod simply tells him that it's too late for him either way, and he finishes the job. The Immortal One informs Griffith that the Behelit would soon return to him, because that's how it is, and tells Guts that the eclipse was coming soon before departing for the Advent, and this is when Wyald actually dies. When the last drop of blood flows out of his body and takes his last breath, Wyald's soul is dragged into the abyss from the inside of his body, and all that remains is the shriveled up husk of an old man, cleaved in half by the Immortal One's horns. Everyone who saw the truth behind Wyald's real self was just as shocked as we were when we first read this story, but looking backwards, it all makes sense. It is clear that after a human commits themselves to demon kind, then that is the precise moment when they stop existing as human beings. After this, they ascend into a higher form of existence, and so when they finally die as apostles, their bodies revert to the form they possessed right before said ascension. We only have proof from one instance before Wyald shows up in the story, and that is the slug count. When Teresia's father's soul was dragged into the abyss, his remains looked near identical to how he looked that day he gave up his wife as a sacrifice, and so I think it's safe to assume that Wyald had become an apostle far too late in his human life. But that doesn't mean he was always destined to become one, because he must have received a Behelit years before he reached his point of ascension. And that's where we come in with our speculation hats on. It is known that, on average, most lower tier apostles tend to be either an exaggerated version of themselves as humans, or the exact opposite versions of themselves as humans. We're suggesting that Wyald was a bit of both. If you've seen any of our videos on the God Hand or its members, well then you should know that a person receives a Behelit because they possess the qualities that fit the criteria for being a demon, but they won't become said demon until they reach a critical point in their lives and trigger the descent of an interstice. After reaching that point, they must sacrifice things that define their humanity in order to be reborn as an apostle, and that's pretty much how this demonic reincarnation thing works. We don't know when Wyald received his Behelit, but we have a pretty nasty feeling that he might have used it on his family of all things, and let us explain why. As an apostle, Wyald is all about excitement and extreme stimulation. He wants to do what he wants to do, and wants to hear no complaints regarding the same. This fierce outlook on life may be a result of a lifetime of Wyald forgoing his pleasure for the sake of others. As an old man, he must have experienced a long life riddled with compromise. At every turn, Wyald was forced to negotiate something with someone, be that money, intellect, or emotions. Though he loved his family, he also kind of wished he could get rid of them, because sometimes the responsibility of being a figurehead got to him in a bad way. Maybe he never wanted a family or any close friends, but only acquired them to make someone else happy. Wyald must have also been a closet pervert in his previous life, because as an apostle, he literally doesn't care whom he takes and where. He will take one woman after another in a round robin just because he could. Now, this wouldn't have been possible for an old man, man, but there is also the possibility that Wyald had some rather extreme thoughts when it came to women, but he wasn't able to express them in his human lifetime. At some point, he found himself in a scenario where he was thrown into the pits of despair and most likely fatally injured because his blood seeped into the behelit he was carrying and summoned the God Hand. Wyald begged for his life back because this time he was going to make things fun and stimulating, and they granted him his wish. When he returned, Wyald was unrecognizable, and not just because he was an apostle now, but he looked taller, younger, far stronger than he was 100 years ago, all when he became an apostle, which also implies that Wyald's ascension was caused by the 100-Year War. After sacrificing his family and or loved ones, Wyald was given a form which would allow him to both enjoy and excite, and deciding to maximize his experience on both, the apostle would often handicap himself, like refusing the sword and taking off his restraints as we mentioned earlier. As you guys can see by now, there is a reason we've avoided talking about Wyald for so long. It's because there is too much to unpack when it comes to this character. He is the most reviling and yet somehow compelling antagonist of Berserk, who has never been brought to the screen. And while it does make sense, it also makes us want to see him in colored action all the more. So, fingers crossed. Here's hoping if someone does a proper adaptation of Berserk that they won't forget about Wyald, because, if you think about it, he appears at an important juncture of the story. Whether you like it or not, that is an entirely different story. Marvelous verdict. And with that, we wrap up today's video. We know you guys have been screaming for Wyald, but honestly, after watching this video, you can see why we waited this long. There is good reason why this guy never shows up in any adaptations of Berserk, and quite frankly, we think that that's a good thing. While it would be great to see Wyald in action, he is one of those villains who does seem more gratuitous than plot-serving. The sheer amount of carnage that he leaves in his wake is enough to make one sick to their gut, and you don't want to be one of those little girls he asks directions from. It is safe to say that Wyald is the worst apostle we have seen in this story, and now you know his story. Thank you so much for watching today's video, and if you enjoyed it, then don't forget to leave us a like and subscribe to never miss out on any of our videos. Until next time, have a good one and be safe.